Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Kingman lecture series. Delighted to see you all here this evening. Not seeing all of you, some of you are going to be remote, but we are pleased to have you. A particular welcome to the Kingman family who is here. A speaker, of course, who will be introduced in a little while. And to everyone else, whether you are a serious mathematician, a closet maths lover, whether you've come to hear a speaker who wrote a book called How to Cook Pie, or whether you are just here to get extracurricular credit. We're really pleased to have you all here. And there's a lot that is good about tonight. First of all, this year we can be in person, and that is a gift for all of us. Secondly, we have a speaker who comes from an amazing country, England. And thirdly, we're all, I think, tired of living in an illogical world. So we are fascinated to hear about the logic that can solve all of that, or maybe not. Let's just have a word of prayer as we begin. Our Lord and our God, we thank you because you are God who created our world, a world that has beauty and that has order. And as we meet here together this evening, we pray for your presence and your blessings. In Jesus' name, amen.
I want to introduce the individuals who have made this tonight's event possible, Robert and Lilith Kingman. Robert and Lilith Kingman moved to Berrien Springs, Michigan 50 years ago, 1971, when Robert Kingman joined the physics faculty at Andrews, where he served as chair of the department for 31 years. In 2003, he was awarded the John Nevins Andrews Medallion in recognition for his contributions to the university, and he's currently Emeritus Professor of Physics here at Andrews. Robert Kingman received his master's and doctoral degrees in physics and a master's degree in mathematics from the University of Arizona. In 2016, Lilith Kingman joined her husband in funding the rebuilding and rededication of the Kingman Observatory on the Andrews campus to serve both the university and the Southwest Michigan community. But they also entertained a dream of establishing a speaker series to bring a variety of thoughtful leaders to inform the university and larger community on important ideas and issues in the areas of science and mathematics. They had seen the benefits of bringing significant speakers in theology to the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary here on campus and recognized leaders in music performance in the Howard Performing Arts Center. But they felt the need to bring world-class scholars in science and mathematics as well. And thus was born the Robert and Lilith Kingman Endowed Speaker Series on Science and Society that was established in 2019. The inaugural speaker was David Wrightsey, presenting Gravitational Waves, a revolution in the way we study the universe. Wrightsey is the executive director of LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory Laboratory, and professor of physics at Caltech. He leads the international team of researchers who detected gravitational waves for the first time in 2015, leading to the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physics for the team's founders. Now we are pleased to welcome mathematician, musician, and author Eugenia Cheng for the second Kingman Lecture, The Art of Logic in an Illogical World. In honor of the Kingman's forethought and generosity, we have signed copies of Dr. Cheng's books to present to them. After the program, the audience will be given the opportunity to procure their own signed copies. Thank you.
When you start with some small talk, one question people might ask is, what do you do? If you are going to ask Dr. Eugenia Cheng what she does, you should probably have a 7 or 8 course meal that you're sitting down to eat together. And after receiving tenure at a university, then she decided she wanted to broaden her life and broaden her impact. And whether she pursues a passion of music and piano performance, and she's also continuing research in category theory, and a scientist in residence at an art institute, so still teaching mathematics to artists, and a whole variety of interests. But at the end of the day, she is still a human being, and I'm pleased that the talk today can connect with each human to see how does the logic interrelate with our life? How can it have an impact in our life? So I'd ask you to welcome Dr. Cheng.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming here, and thank you again to the Kingman family for the generous endowment of this lecture series, and thank you to Professor Weldon and the math department for inviting me here to speak to you all today. This is actually the very first live talk that I have done since COVID, so I'm a little weirded out, but also unbelievably excited to see you, so I apologize if I get really loud because I'm so excited. Thank you. As I'm sure you've all experienced, I'm grateful that we were able to use technology for all of these months, still to get some communication done, but it's nothing like being in front of real live people. And here we are, and I'd like to, on that note, I would like to take a moment to recognize and pay tribute to the struggles that we've all been through in the last 2 years. And everyone has had different struggles. And that's because we're all individuals, and we can have different experiences but still be united. And some people have experienced having too much work, healthcare workers and teachers especially, and other frontline workers, while others have experienced having not enough work or no work. And some people have lost income, some people have lost their homes, some people have lost their loved ones, and some people, like me actually, have experienced some grief and trauma that was completely unrelated to the pandemic. And all of those experiences are different, but we're all human. And when I think about what we've been through in the last couple of years, we have seen, along with the pandemic, and before the pandemic, and during it, and after it, unfortunately, we have seen continued polarization of public discourse in so many different ways, in terms of politics and what happened after the election and is still happening, in terms of the way that the pandemic was responded to, things that shouldn't be political, like, well, maybe shouldn't be political, like healthcare and vaccines and mask wearing. And science itself, polarization about climate change, about voting rights, about Black Lives Mattering, about other kinds of rights. And we may not all agree on all of those things, and we probably don't all agree about those things. But among all of those things, and in this very divided discourse, I ask myself, what can I, as a mathematician, contribute? How can I, as a mathematician, help this situation? Because that's what I am always asking myself. I don't want to just sit in a corner and lament. It's very easy to do. There's a lot to lament about. And I do it as much as anyone else does, but I don't want to just sit there and moan. I want to do something to help. And that's why I do the work that I do. That's why I'm in education, because I want to provide ways to help people be able to think better about these things, as I think every academic discipline should. And that's why I wrote this book, The Art of Logic in an Illogical World. It was after the 2016 election cycle, and I was teaching my art students and thinking to myself, how can I help? What can I do? And at some level, I wished I could have been a doctor, because I think that being a doctor is the most amazing thing you can do to save people's lives. And I wasn't really cut out for that. What I can do is explain mathematics to people. And then I realized that this can help more broadly than I thought, because actually, I use my discipline as a pure mathematician to help me understand all of these divisive political arguments. And that may seem surprising, and I realize that to many people that is surprising, and so I decided to write a book about it, to try and show how I use mathematical thinking to help me think through those things that don't seem like mathematics to many people. And so that's what I would like to talk about today. And my starting point for this is that pure mathematics is not just about numbers and equations. It's not just about getting the right answer. It might seem like that if your experience of school math curriculum was just about getting the right answer or possibly getting the wrong answer. So I say that pure mathematics is a framework for agreeing on things. And I don't mean that we can all use math and suddenly agree about everything in the world. That's completely unrealistic. So I'm not going to say that. But pure mathematicians in their research have a curious ability to agree on what counts as right and what counts as not so good. And the reason is because they have set up a very strong framework of logic. And we use logic in a very rigorous way to build rigorous arguments. And the thing about logic is that it doesn't really work in the human world, because the human world is too full of illogical things. It's too full of messy details. And that's why it works in the abstract world. That's why we go to the abstract world to use logic. The abstract world is a bit removed from the human world. So you might think that everything that a pure mathematician does is very removed from real life. And I used to think that as well. I used to think that this was the model of what math is like, that pure math, which is what I do, is only really relevant to applied math, which is the kind of more useful part of math, supposedly, and that applied math is useful to science, and science is useful to engineering and medicine, which is useful to some part of the human world that we might call the quantitative part, the part that can be studied using numbers and equations. And this is true, but it's narrow. And one of the problems with it being so narrow is it enables some people to say, well, I'm glad somebody does it, but I don't need to do it. And for example, all my art students, they're not going to become scientists or engineers or doctors. They're never going to use that kind of math in their daily lives. And many people in the arts and humanities may also feel that math, they don't need it because they're not going to use it in their daily lives. And then they get proved right because you study quadratic equations and trigonometry, and I don't use quadratic equations in my daily life, and I don't do trigonometry in my daily life either, not explicitly anyway. So what do? I use the discipline of pure mathematics to help me think, because I think that actually pure math is about how to think. And thus, it is about the entire human world, at least the part that thinks. And sometimes it seems like that is not a whole lot of the human world. But wouldn't it be nice if more people were able to think better? And I believe that every academic discipline provides a framework for deciding what counts as good information. And this is really important, because if you don't have a framework for deciding that, then anyone can just make up anything and declare it to be true. And unfortunately, we see an awful lot of that happening at the moment. And that's not what math does. Math says that the framework we're going to use is logic. And that's different. Science has a different framework, history has a different framework, and all of those things give a different point of view on a way to establish what counts as good information. And now that we all have access to too much information through the internet, that is such an important skill. It's not that knowledge is power anymore because we've got too much knowledge. It's the ability to discern what counts as good knowledge, which I think is much more important. And that's why I believe that pure math is such an important part of everybody's education, even if you're not going to become any of those things in the narrow part of the mathematical picture. But it's important to note that I'm not saying that it's going to enable us to agree about all of our conclusions. But what I think we can agree about is the processes we use to get to those conclusions, because we're never going to agree about all our conclusions. But math helps us, I think, to unpack what somebody else is thinking in their terms, rather than in our terms. Because if I try and understand what someone else is thinking, according to my logic, it may well seem illogical, but it's not illogical to them. It's logical to them in their context. And math helps us to be able to unpack things according to other people's context so that we can crucially understand other people. And that's something that I think is so missing from political discourse at the moment. So what I'm going to talk about today is how math arises from analogies and how pure math enables us to study the interconnectedness of things, because I think that we are all interconnected. Some people think that we're just all individuals who should fight for ourselves, but I don't believe that. And I'll show a way in which pure math studies relationships between things. My research field is category theory, which is very focused on relationships rather than intrinsic characteristics. And then I'll show how these abstract principles enable us potentially to pivot between different points of view so that we don't just get fixed in our own point of view, but then we can see things from other people's points of view. And then I'll talk about how I think this is incorporated into my view of what counts as intelligence. And I hope that we're all trying to be intelligent. And so I'll finish by saying how I think this fits into intelligence for me. So first of all, I say that pure mathematics is a theory of analogies. If we have 2 apples and 2 bananas, we might say, oh, what do these 2 situations have in common? Well, they're both 2 things. And this is how we come up with the idea of numbers in the first place. We're probably all quite used to the concept of numbers, and we haven't noticed that they're really abstract. What is 2? 2 is what these things have in common. It's sort of two-ness. And what math does is it takes that concept really seriously as a thing in its own right. We don't just say 2 apples are analogous to 2 bananas. We say that analogy is caused by them both being 2 things. I'm going to consider that to be a concept, and I'm going to study it, and that's abstract math. And the thing is that there are different levels of abstraction you can take. For example, we could say that they're both examples of 2 fruits, which is true. That's slightly less abstract than saying they're 2 things. It's got a bit more of the real-world context in it. And so you might think, oh, well, that's more realistic. But the thing is that what we lose now is the ability to include more examples, such as 2 chairs. So actually, if we go more abstract to the level of 2 things, we seem to have gone further away from real life. But actually, what we've done is enabled us to bring in more examples. And to me, that's what abstraction is about. Yes, it seems to take us away from real life, but it means we can study more things. And so personally, I think of it not as really taking us away from real life, but taking us deep into the heart of the essence of what's going on. So we can go one step further, that 1 plus 2 and 2 plus 3 are both examples of A plus B. And people often say to me, I was fine with math until the numbers turned into letters. And the thing is that turning numbers into letters has a point. It's an abstraction where we can then talk about many different situations at the same time. And then we can do this again and say 1 times 2 and 2 times 3 are both examples of A times B. And then we can go even further and say A plus B and A times B. Well, they're both examples of A blah B, where blah is what mathematicians call a binary operation. And that's something that you might not study until you get to maybe abstract algebra as a math undergraduate. So these levels are like levels of progression through typical math education, but they're also levels of abstraction, and there are further levels of abstraction above that. And the field I study, category theory, is so abstract that even some pure mathematicians say it's too abstract. But my wonderful PhD supervisor, Martin Hyland, taught me that the point isn't to just continue to try and be more and more abstract arbitrarily. The point is to pick a good level of abstraction for what we're trying to understand now, and importantly, to remain able to switch between different levels for different purposes so you don't get stuck in any one point of view. So here is another example. What do puff pastry and viruses have in common? Well, they're both governed by the math of exponentials. Because when you make puff pastry, what you do is you fold the pastry in thirds, and then you fold it in thirds again. You fold it in 3, you fold it in 3, you keep folding it in 3. And that means that you multiply the number of layers by 3 repeatedly, which is an exponential. And that's, unfortunately, how viruses work, that each person infects a certain number of people, say 3, and then each of those people infects 3 people, and each of those, so we keep multiplying the number of infections by 3, so it's an exponential. And mathematicians study that in its own right, the concept of exponentials, which is why, when the pandemic began, people who understood exponentials understood that this was a very dangerous situation. even before it was obviously dangerous, because some people said, well, nothing much is happening. But if you understand exponentials, you know that they start without very much happening, and then they suddenly go whoosh, like that. And that studying this abstractly enables us to know that without having to experience it. And some people say, oh, there's nothing like learning. You can only really learn things by experience. But for me, the point of learning things not by experience is so that we can avoid some of those experiences that we're trying to avoid. Here is a much more contentious example about which I'm sure that many of us disagree. But I'm not trying to get us to agree. I'm trying us to get us to see what the logic is inside this situation and where the different levels of abstraction are. So some people do not think that same-sex marriage should be allowed, and they think it is different from from straight marriage. And some people think that it isn't really different. And the thing is that both of those are logically valid. It just depends what level of analogy you're going to. And so if you think that marriage should be between an unrelated man and woman, then indeed, same-sex marriage does not count. But if you go one step further and think that it's just two unrelated adults, then it does count. And the thing about normal life arguments is that we usually don't make clear what level of abstraction we're using. And that leaves us open to ambiguity and then contentious arguments where we just yell backwards and forwards about you're wrong, no, you're wrong. And that doesn't really get us anywhere. Whereas because in math we make clear what level we're going to, we iron out that particular ambiguity. So as I was saying, it doesn't mean we will agree about everything, but at least we can have a better agreement about what we're even talking about in the first place. And if we don't do that, then what happens is that some people are prone to saying, oh, well, if you're going to allow same-sex marriage, then you're going to allow maybe just any old two adults. I've redacted what that is. Or maybe any two humans. Or maybe any two living creatures. Or maybe even any two creatures. And the thing is, those are different levels. And just because some people have gone up to this level doesn't mean, logically, that they've necessarily gone up to those other levels. But if we're not clear about what level we're working at, then there can be misunderstandings arising. And indeed, I would like to remind you that before we got to the level of an unrelated man and woman, there was a level below that where some people thought it had to be an unrelated man and woman of the same race. And I am personally glad that we're not in that position anymore. So another argument that has been going on is that some people still think that COVID is just the same as seasonal flu. Well, it is and it isn't. And in math, it may seem that we deal with equations a lot, which is just saying one thing is equal to another. But actually what we're doing is we're saying here is a sense in which some things are the same. At the same time, here is a sense in which those things are not the same. That's why equations are helpful. If they were just things that were obviously the same, we'd never get anywhere. But the point of an equation is to say, actually, these two things that seemed different in this one way are the same in this other way. And that enables us to move our understanding and pivot between different situations. And I think it's more productive if someone thinks that two things are the same and we don't. It's more productive to acknowledge the sense in which they are, because there usually is a sense in which they are. And typically, when people disagree, I think it's much more productive to go, well, here is the sense in which their point of view is valid, and here is a sense in which my point of view is valid, and then we can work from there. So yes, COVID and seasonal flu are both contagious viruses causing respiratory illnesses and fatalities. But also, COVID, it's actually a different virus. It's more contagious and more severe. The vaccine is new. There's only been very recent scientific understanding of it. There are much more dramatic mutations that are much more dangerous. It affects younger people. There are many ways in which it's different. But it is true that there are some ways in which it is the same, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. And that's why I like to think about these different levels at which things can be the same and different. And whenever I see arguments in life where people are yelling at each other saying that's the same as this, no, it's not, I try and think of a diagram like this in my head. And I didn't draw these diagrams explicitly until I was trying to explain it to my art students. And one of the wonderful things I think about teaching is that to explain things to other people, you have to understand them much better yourself. And that is a wonderful opportunity for me to understand things more deeply. And teaching art students has kind of pushed me to understand much more deeply how I use mathematical thinking to understand arguments like this, and then to make it precise and then explain it to them. So here are some diagrams I like drawing, thinking about interconnectedness. Here's one of my favorite diagrams of interconnectedness. It's the famous map of the London Underground. I feel somewhat in exile. I've not been back to London for more than 2 years, which is by far the longest I've ever been away, but it wasn't wise to go back recently. And this map of the London Underground is wonderful for getting around the London Underground, but it's not geographically accurate. All it shows is the connections between different stops and which lines go there. And the thing is that because it's not geographically accurate, you end up with things like hapless American tourists trying to take the train from Leicester Square to Covent Garden because it doesn't look like it's very far away, but actually it's right next to each other. Things like that. However, the geographically accurate London Underground map looks like this, which is a giant mess and impossible to understand. And it's not that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. It's that they are focusing on different concepts, different relations, and therefore they're useful for different purposes. So this one is much better for getting around. And when you're actually on a train, it doesn't really matter exactly where your tunnel is going. Whereas this one's kind of interesting. I think it's interesting. I grew up taking the London Underground a lot, and so my picture of London was just a series of kind of rabbit holes, and then you pop up out of a rabbit hole, and you never really know how the whole thing fits together. So it's quite interesting seeing this. So the point is that we focus on different aspects of a situation in different situations, in different contexts, in order to study different things. But we don't forget those other details forever. We just temporarily focus on something and then leave open the possibility of changing our focus to something else. But in this diagram of the London Underground, the thing we're focusing on is just in what way things are connected with each other. And that's a very important concept in mathematics and in thinking through life situations as well. So one thing I sometimes think about is why relationships break down, which I think is very sad. And what might happen is that one person, say Alex, feels disrespected, which means that Alex can't show love, which means that Sam feels unloved, and maybe that means that Sam is unable to show respect, which means that Alex feels disrespected. And so what we have here is a vicious circle. And we can say that there are two different types of arrow here. We can look a bit more closely. These are kind of action responses, and these are feelings responses. And then you can ask yourself how we can break this cycle. Maybe it's not very easy to change how you feel in response to a situation, but perhaps you could learn to behave differently according to it. So perhaps even when Alex feels disrespected, Alex could concentrate on still showing love so that the vicious cycle doesn't happen. Or maybe when Sam feels unloved, Sam could still concentrate on showing respect so that the vicious cycle doesn't happen. And so then we could say to ourselves, well, then who is it who should break the cycle? Who should go first? And one answer I've seen is that whoever is more mature should take it upon themselves to break that cycle. So this is a vicious circle, and unfortunately vicious circles arise in all sorts of places around us. A particularly tragic one is police violence, especially against black people in this country. And maybe there's a vicious cycle here where perhaps police feel threatened by black people, and as a result they use excessive force because they think that they're threatened and they need to protect themselves. And as a result, black people in turn feel threatened by the police, and as a result they defend themselves against the police, and as a result the police feel threatened by black people. And again we have actions arrows and feelings arrows. But I'd also like to say, some people say, well, black people should just obey the law, and then they won't have the police after them. But it's important to note that even when they are, for example, just sitting at home eating ice cream on the couch, it can happen that police violence against them gets them killed. And so then we can say, well, who should take it upon themselves to break that cycle? And then we probably won't agree about this, but at least we can have a more sensible conversation. I think that the police are the people who hold power in this situation, and that it could be possible to train them to de-escalate situations in their action rather than escalate. And in other countries, there are places where they are more trained in de-escalation, and we see that often when the perpetrator is a white person, they are able to de-escalate situations, so maybe that's possible. But other people are convinced that it's black people who should be not behaving the way they do, and then we won't agree about the outcome or what we should do, but we can, I think, have a more sensible conversation about it. And we can also look at other vicious cycles, such as one during lockdown, where we were told to stay at home, and then some people felt sad and depressed about being confined at home, which means that they went out. And because they went out, more people got infected, which meant that we had to stay home more, and round it went. And unfortunately, we kind of did the worst of both worlds. We didn't stay at home quite enough to stop the pandemic, but we did stay at home just enough to cause economic disaster. And so we didn't really do this very well at all, I think. Have we learnt anything from it? I don't know. So some more diagrams of interconnectedness that I've drawn before include this one about the egregious United incident from a few years ago, where someone was kicked off a plane because they had too many people on the plane. Nobody offered, and so they asked someone to leave. He didn't want to leave, so they called security. They dragged him off. He got injured on the way out. And there were many divisive arguments. I almost think back fondly of a time when divisive arguments were just about security on planes and not about global pandemics. But anyway, some people said, oh, well, it's his fault. He should have just done what he was told. And then some other people said, well, it was the security's fault. They shouldn't have used excessive force. And I saw someone say, it's your fault, all of you, because you sometimes miss flights. And because you sometimes miss flights, that's why the airlines overbook flights. And that's why they had to take someone off the plane, which I think was a little bit extreme, but there was a point to it. So I drew a giant diagram of all the things that were involved, the end result being injury. And the text is very small because there are so many things here, but you don't really have to read the text. It's just the interconnectedness that I want to show. So why was there an injury caused? Because he refused to leave, and also security used force. And also, well, the airline called security in the first place. Now, why did he refuse to leave? Well, he wanted to get to work. He worked as a doctor in a hospital. You might think that was a kind of good reason to want to get to work. Why did the airline even choose that person to kick off in the first place? Was there some kind of racial profiling going on? And why did they even need to kick people off? Well, because nobody volunteered. Why did nobody volunteer? Well, the airline offered too little money, and also people wanted to get home more than the amount of money that they were offered. And also, the airline decided to remove people. Well, they decided to remove people because the flight was too full, and it turned out there was a crew. They needed to get some crew somewhere, and so they needed seats on the plane to get the crew. Why did that happen? Did they have some crew scheduling issue? And, well, why was the flight too full? The flight was too full because it was overbooked and not enough people showed up. They overbook on the assumption that some people won't show up. Why do they overbook? Because some people miss flights. So finally, we have that there is that cause, but all of these things contributed to the end result. And we can simplify this situation by just focusing on one of them. And it is very tempting to simplify situations in the world by just forgetting some of the details. The world is a complicated place, and so we need to simplify it to understand it. But I think a better way to simplify the world is to become more intelligent. Because then the world becomes simpler relative to your brain. And I think that's more productive. And if you get really used to understanding interconnectedness, then this doesn't seem complicated anymore. And then, when there's a pandemic, you can sit down, as I did, and think about all the things that contributed to the pandemic. And you end up with a diagram. Well, so far, we have 242 million cases and 4.91 million people dead. The last time I talked about this, I edited the slide today, and I saw that the last time I talked about this, it was 140 million cases and 3.91 million dead, and that was only 3 months ago. So I drew this diagram. This is how much I understood at the time. You can't see all of it, but the point is to understand the contributing factors rather than focusing on one thing. And some people just ended up saying, well, this whole thing happened because some dude ate a bat in China. Anyway, moving on. These diagrams are very related to diagrams in my field of study, which is category theory. And category theory studies relationships between things rather than their intrinsic characteristics. And it says that we can learn a lot about a situation by looking at how things relate. Just like you can understand a lot about a person by seeing how they interact with other people. And you watch them interact with different types of people, you understand more about them. And sometimes, I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you think someone was a nice person, and then you see them interact with a server in a restaurant, and you realize that there's a problem there. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the factors of 30, and we had I think it was quite an interesting session this afternoon doing this. So if you were there this afternoon, this will hopefully seem a little familiar to you. But we study the factors of 30 in math. This is the most mathy looking thing I've talked about in this talk so far, probably. So the factors of 30 are 1, 2, I'm sure we can all remember, 3, 5, 6, 10, 15, and 30. Okay, it's not very interesting. I don't think it's very interesting. Many people have trauma from past math experiences at school, and sometimes I just say a word. Last semester, a student said to me, "You said the word permutation," she said, and I had so much trauma I had to sit in a bath for 20 minutes. And I thought, I'm really glad she told me that, because I didn't use the word straight off. I did some things, and I said, these are called permutations, and that was it. She had to go and take a bath for 20 minutes. Luckily, it was a video, so she could just press pause and go and do that. She then ended up telling me she was watching the videos in the bath, and that was helping, which is an advantage, right? You can't do that with live teaching. So I'm now going to find some geometry of this situation by looking at which factors are also related to each other. So some of these numbers are factors of each other. And I'm going to draw something like a family tree showing those relationships. It's not actually going to look like a tree. We'll see what it looks like. So 30 goes at the top like a kind of great-grandparent, and 6, 10, and 15 are the next generation down from 30. But 5 is another generation down, because 5 is a factor of both 10 and 15. And we don't need an arrow going directly from 30 to 5, because we can deduce that from going through 10 or through 15. Just like we don't need to draw grandparent generations in a family tree, because we can deduce them from parent-child relationships. Similarly, 2 is a factor of 6 and 10, and 3 is a factor of 6 and 15, and 1 is a factor of 2, 3, and 5. I'm just going to loosen the wire of the microphone because it's got a bit stuck. Okay, there. So now we see that this is the corners of a cube, which I think is a bit more interesting than a bunch of numbers floating around on a straight line. And then you might say to yourself, if you think mathematically, you go, why? Why is it a cube? Do all numbers make cubes? What other shapes can you make? Why did this happen? And that's what we explored at lunchtime in the afternoon session. And I do this with my students, and they actually get quite into studying the factors of these numbers and what shapes they make. And one student, an art student, said to me, "This is the first time I've ever wanted to factor a number." And I thought, well, that's good. I'm glad we did that. And as we did this, I discovered more and more about this situation with my students, and I love how they push me to see more things because they see things from so many different points of view themselves. So the reason that this is a cube is that it has 3 prime factors. Prime factors are the numbers that aren't divisible by anything else except 1 and themselves. 1 doesn't count because you can't get anywhere by multiplying by 1. So what we have here is a diagram of the prime factors in each position. So 2, 3, and 5 are prime, and 30 is 2 times 3 times 5. That's its prime factorization. And then at the next level up, we have numbers that have 2 prime factors. So 6 is 2 times 3, 10 is 2 times 5, 15 is 3 times 5, and then at the top we have 2, 3, and 5. So we can move from that middle diagram back to the one on the left by multiplying together the numbers at each corner. It's just a different presentation. But now the one on the left is numbers and factors. The one in the middle is sets and subsets. And so at the top we have a set of 3 numbers, 2, 3, and 5. And then at the next level down we have all the subsets containing 2 numbers, and then all the subsets containing 1 number, and that thing at the bottom is the empty set symbol containing nothing. And then you might look at that and go, oh wait, well it didn't have to be 2, 3, and 5. It could have been any 3 prime numbers, and we could call them A, B, and C. So I've turned them into letters again. And then we can immediately use some other prime numbers like 2, 3, and 7, for example. So if we multiply 2, 3, and 7, we get 42. And here are the prime factors of here are all the factors of 42. But now we can build it up from the ground up because we've understood it comes from prime factors. So we start with the prime factors 2, 3, and 7. Then we put the numbers that are products of 2 prime factors, and then 42 goes at the top. And then if I put the other diagrams back in, the one in the middle shows the set of prime factors at each corner. And the one on the right is back to the A, B, and C. So the one in the middle is analogous to the one on the previous slide. But when we go up one level of abstraction to the one on the right, it's actually the same diagram now. And so this is what I love about abstraction, that you don't just say things are analogous. You actually find the thing that's making them analogous. And I want to show you what I think the point is of going to the level of A, B, and C. But first I want to stress that 6 is less than 7. This may not sound profound, but it's very profound. And maybe if I say it with a more profound voice, 6 is less than 7. But the point is that 6 is less than 7 while being higher up than 7. So despite 6 being smaller than 7, 6 is higher up in the diagram. And that's because 6 has more prime factors than 7. So what's happening is we have two hierarchies on those numbers. We have the hierarchy of size, but we also have a hierarchy of how many prime factors you have. And those hierarchies don't agree. And whenever in life you have two hierarchies that don't agree on a set of people, there's a possible source of antagonism there. Such as, for example, if one person is older than somebody else, but the other person is more senior at work. Or when a young person earns more money than an older person. That can be a source of tension. And whenever that happens, I look out for those places that can be a source of tension. But now what I want to do is say, well, now that we've gone to the level of A, B, and C, these didn't have to be prime numbers. They didn't even have to be numbers. They could be any three things. For example, 3 types of privilege, such as rich, white, and male. And then at the next level down, we'll have people with 2 of those types of privilege, rich and white, rich and male, and white male. And then at the next level, people with only 1 type, rich, white, or male. And then at the bottom, people with none of those 3 types. So if I put back the missing words, we have rich, white, non-male people, rich, non-white male people, and so on. And at the bottom, non-rich, non-white, non-male people. And the first thing I'd like to stress is that whenever I talk about this, everyone in the room typically self-identifies as non-rich. And while it's true that we're all less rich than somebody else, we're also all more rich than somebody else. And I'm going to come back to this, but if we only ever see ourselves as less rich than other people, we'll miss the fact that we are also much better off than many other people. Another important thing about this diagram is that it shows each arrow in the diagram of subsets showed losing one thing from the set. And in this diagram, it shows losing one type of privilege directly. And this is something important about what the theory of privilege means. Some white people get upset about it and point at a super rich black sports star and say, see, there's a rich black person. There's no such thing as white privilege. But that's not what white privilege means. It doesn't mean that all black people are better off than all white people. It just means that if you're white and everything about you stayed the same, but you weren't white anymore, then we would expect you to be worse off in society. For example, because you would be marginalized or because you would fear for your life when the police came along. But there's something else about this diagram that I think is really important, which is like the fact that 6 is less than 7. So if we look at the 3 sets of people along the top level with 2 types of privilege, there aren't any arrows between them because there is no direct loss of privilege from one of those people to another. But we can think about how well we think those people are doing in an absolute sense in society. And I think that rich, white, non-male people, such as rich white women, are probably doing better than rich, non-white male people, who are probably doing better than poor white men. And the same is true at this level. And then I think it's even more skewed, because if you look at the rich, non-white, non-male people, you know, being rich makes up for a lot of things. I think those people are probably doing better than poor white men. We can think about some specific examples, such as, say, Oprah Winfrey or Michelle Obama, definitely doing better than poor white men in the middle of America somewhere who are unemployed or maybe homeless, don't have health care, are sick. And so I think it's like this. I think it's like the fact that 6 is less than 7. That this has helped me understand why so many people, especially poor white men, are so angry about the theory of privilege, because they're told that they are very privileged because they have 2 types of privilege. But they see people with supposedly less privilege than them doing better than them, and they don't feel any of the manifestation of their supposed privilege. And I think it's a cuboid, not a cube. And that this has helped me understand that anger. And I think that's much more productive than just getting angry back at them. And if we understand the structural source of that anger, then we can examine what it is that they feel more hard done by about. Often when I talk about this, people get upset, and then it turns out it's because although they are ostensibly a fairly well-off white man, for example, there is something else that they feel that they have struggled with that is being overlooked. Like maybe they grew up very poor and worked very hard, or maybe they're an immigrant, or maybe they were very sick when they were a child, things like that. And then we can get further into understanding these things rather than just yelling backwards and forwards, which unfortunately there's too much yelling backwards and forwards these days. These kinds of diagrams and ways of thinking enable me to pivot between different points of view so that I can understand what it's like being in different positions. You can never really understand somebody else's experience, but you can try and empathize by making an analogy. And I think that empathy is a form of analogy between different people. So here are some pivots that I use for myself. Oh, not yet. Here is a pivot that I think about according to those diagrams. So those diagrams are all analogous diagrams. And 30, 42, and rich white men are all in the analogous position in those different situations. And so we can make some other analogies. So the structural power that male people have over female people. Now, I don't mean that every man has power over every woman. I just mean that they hold power in society. That's what structural power is. That's analogous to the structural power that white people have over black people, which is also analogous to the structural power that rich people have over poor people. But it's not analogous if we change the direction of the arrow. So the power that male people have over female people, that's different from the interaction between female people and male people, because the arrow is the other way. And this is a sense in which it is different. Say, if men sexually harass women, which unfortunately they do. Some people say, well, women do it to men too. Unfortunately, that is also true. But there is a sense in which it is different because the power structures are the other way up. Now, once we've acknowledged that there is a sense in which it's the same and a sense in which it's different, then we can have a conversation about how that manifests itself in the actual experiences and which point of view is illuminating for what we're trying to do. So something could be at the top in one situation, but not at the top in another. For example, in this diagram, rich white men are at the top. And one of the homework exercises I give to my students, I believe it's this week actually, so they'll be submitting their work this weekend. But one of the homework exercises I get them to do is to draw one diagram of privilege in which they're at the top, another one in which they're at the bottom, and another one in which they're in the middle, using different types of privilege, so that we can feel what it's like to be in different positions. And rich white men are at the top in this context. Rich white non-men are not at the top in this context. But if we just restrict to the context of women, then we will see that we could pick 3 types of privilege among women, such as being rich, white, and cisgender. And in that context, rich white cis women are at the top. They occupy the analogous position that rich white men do in broader society. And this has helped me understand why there's so much anger in some parts of the feminist movement, especially towards rich white women, and especially towards rich white cis women. And remember that cisgender means that the gender identity you were given at birth is the same as the one that you consider yourself to have now. And you may or may not agree that people have the right to pick their own gender identity, but it remains true that people who feel that they have a different gender identity from the one they were assigned at birth suffer all sorts of forms of harassment, marginalization, and violence. So poor non-white trans women are at the bottom of this diagram. And some rich white women only see themselves in the previous diagram and only feel the oppression of rich white men, especially if they tend to mix only with rich white people. And so then they forget how very privileged they are compared with all of these other women, which causes a lot of antagonism. And so we're all less privileged than somebody and more privileged than somebody else. And if we only ever see ourselves at the bottom of the diagram, then we will not see how other people see us at the top of another one. And then we will be failing to empathize and failing to find a way to help other people as well as lament our own woes. So here, I think, are some pivots that I do to help me understand what it's like to be at the top and at the bottom of different diagrams. For example, as an Asian person, I'm a non-white person, and I do feel in many ways marginalized relative to white people. However, I also acknowledge that Asian people are probably the most privileged of non-white people, and much more privileged, especially here, than black people. And so I can understand both what it's like to be a marginalized person according to race, and also to be in a position of extra privilege. In terms of wealth, I'm not so rich that I never need to work again, but I feel lucky that I can work hard and do fine in life. And that's much better than some people who are really struggling. Maybe they can't get a job, or maybe they're working 3 part-time jobs and still can't make ends meet. And that's a much worse situation. And so here is the pivot that white women could do. While feeling marginalized by white men, they could also understand that they're better off than non-white women. And so whenever you take 2 types of privilege, whether it's through gender or wealth or race or anything, if you take 2 types and you've only got one of them, then you can simultaneously think about the one that you don't have and also think about the one that you do have, and then do a pivot like this. And so I think that all of these techniques and ways of thinking contribute to what I think counts as intelligence. And I think about what I think is intelligence because I would like to be intelligent, and because I'm an educator, and so I want to think about what it is that I want to encourage my students to be able to do with their minds. And I think I've decided that intelligence has various components. I think it involves being reasonable, being powerfully logical, and crucially also being helpful. You can be rational till you're blue in the face and logical blue in the face and sit in a cave and do nothing with it, and I don't think that would be very intelligent. I think that it's important to do something that you believe is helpful in the world with it. And so what does reasonable mean? I think that reasonable means not only that, well, you are able to be reasoned with, but that you use logic and that you have a framework for what counts as good information. Too many people just go, well, I think this is true, and all opinions are valid, so my opinion is valid. And you may believe that, and that may be valid, but I think it's more powerful to have logic, but be powerfully logical with it, so that you can actually unpack your own logic back to some basic principles and understand where your beliefs are coming from. And crucially, understand where other people's beliefs are coming from as well. So if you're powerfully logical, not only can you build up and follow complex logical arguments, you can also unpack your own beliefs back to basic beliefs, but you can also look at somebody else's beliefs and unpack their logical system to uncover what their fundamental beliefs are. So I think that being powerfully logical is more than just being logical. It's about having techniques for using that logic and building it and analyzing it. And then crucially, being helpful involves all of those things and having techniques for logic, but also it involves invoking and using human emotions. And that is so important. And I think that any of us who are math and science educators know this, that if you just keep talking math facts and proofs all along without actually engaging students' emotional responses, then nothing will go in. And I think, unfortunately, this happens too much in political arguments, that there are some people who believe in science and there are some people who unfortunately don't. And the more that those of us who believe in science kind of yell about science and evidence, that it doesn't help, because other people aren't working on those grounds. They may be working according to fear or some fundamental belief, or they feel insulted by being told that they're stupid, and that doesn't help. And so it's so important for us to find ways to use an emotional connection to understand other people's logic, and also to use logic to understand other people's emotions. And so in the end, I think that logic can actually help us with understanding other people. It can help us with empathy, and that empathy can help us to take action in the ways that we want to with the way that we treat logical systems. And so we've had too many vicious circles in this talk, but I think that this is a virtuous circle. And I believe that abstract mathematics can help us create this virtuous circle. And it may seem rather optimistic of me to think that we can do better, but I am an educator, and so I have to be, or maybe that's why I'm an educator, because I am an optimist, and because I do believe that we can do better, and that in particular we can help the next generation to do better. And that's why I do what I do, and that's why I came here to share with you some of my ideas about abstract mathematics and logic. Thank you very much.
Dr. Cheng, thank you so much for coming to our university and helping us see how we can apply math to our lives, even if we aren't mathematicians. So on behalf of our university and the math department, we'd like to present you with this token of our appreciation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And in just a few minutes, we'll be back, and in the lobby, we'll have books if you would like to purchase some books, and she'd be willing to sign them. So thank you very much for coming.